One day before my due date, while my hospital bag was sitting by the front door, my medical paperwork was neatly organized on the kitchen table, and my phone was charging in preparation for the call that could come at any moment. My husband informed me that he was leaving for an entire weekend at a luxury golf resort with his parents, and for a few seconds I genuinely thought he was joking. Because no reasonable person looks at a woman who is 39 weeks pregnant and decides that their perfect time for a golf vacation is the day before she is expected to give birth. But when I saw him folding clothes into a suitcase and loading his golf gear into the trunk of his car, I realized he was completely serious. And while I was still trying to understand how such a decision was even possible, he was already explaining why I was the one being unreasonable. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Meyer Collins, and until that moment I believed I had a reasonably happy marriage, not perfect, because perfect marriages mostly exist on social media, but stable enough to welcome our first child together. For months I had endured sleepless nights, constant discomfort, swollen feet, back pain, and all the challenges that come with pregnancy while imagining what our lives would look like once our son finally arrived. And although my husband Ryan had never been the most attentive man in the world, I always assumed that when the truly important moment arrived he would be there, because even immature people understand that the birth of a child is one of those events where you simply show up and do your job. Ryan saw things differently. While I stood frozen beside our bed staring at the suitcase he was packing, he calmly explained that the trip had been booked months ago, that his parents had already paid a significant amount of money, that cancelling at the last minute would be wasteful, and that the baby probably would not arrive during the weekend anyway. The more he talked, the more surreal the conversation became, because at no point did he mention my safety, my anxiety, or the possibility that I might need help if labor started unexpectedly. Every argument revolved around money, golf, reservations, and his parents' expectations, as though the birth of our son were merely an inconvenience disrupting a recreational schedule. I tried reasoning with him, reminding him that my doctor had repeatedly warned us that labor could begin at any time, showing him appointment notes we had both reviewed together, and asking what exactly he planned to do if my water broke while he was several hours away. But every question seemed to irritate him more than the last, because people who know they are making a selfish decision often become defensive when forced to explain it. Eventually, he accused me of trying to control his life, claimed I was using the pregnancy to manipulate him emotionally, and insisted that he deserved one final weekend of freedom before becoming a full-time father, a statement so ridiculous that I initially thought I had misunderstood it, because becoming a father was not some unexpected development. He had known for 9 months exactly what was coming. What hurt even more than his decision was discovering that his parents fully supported it. Less than an hour later, my mother-in-law called me, and instead of convincing her son to stay home, she began explaining why I should be more understanding. She talked about how stressful the pregnancy had supposedly been for Ryan, how important it was for him to relax before the baby arrived, and even suggested that women gave birth every day without turning it into a major family event. And while listening to her, I finally realized something I should have understood much earlier. Ryan's behavior did not exist in isolation. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who excused every selfish choice he made and protected him from the consequences afterward. That night I barely slept, partly because of the anxiety and partly because the baby seemed unusually active. Every time I closed my eyes I imagined different scenarios, some harmless and some terrifying, and several times I convinced myself that Ryan would come to his senses before morning, that he would realize how absurd the situation was and cancel the trip. But at 6 o'clock the next morning I heard the front door close, and when I looked through the window I saw him loading his golf clubs into his father's vehicle and driving away exactly like a man heading off on vacation, not like someone whose wife was about to give birth to their first child. For the first few hours I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I made breakfast, organized baby supplies, answered messages from relatives asking how I felt, and attempted to focus on anything other than the growing knot in my stomach. But shortly after noon I began feeling mild contractions. At first they were easy to dismiss, subtle enough to blame on exhaustion or stress. Yet as the afternoon progressed, they became more regular and increasingly difficult to ignore, so I immediately called Ryan, expecting that at the very least he would answer and reassure me, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again 10 minutes later with the same result. Then I sent text messages, then voice messages, then attempted to contact his parents, and every effort ended in complete silence. I kept trying to remain calm because I was not yet certain that labor had truly begun, but an hour later the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The contractions were arriving with increasing consistency, and walking around the house required more concentration than before. I called Ryan repeatedly, leaving message after message, until I finally received a short text that made my stomach drop. He wrote that he was busy on the golf course, that I was probably overreacting again, and that I should only contact him if there was a real emergency. I remember reading those words several times because my brain refused to accept that the father of my child had actually written them. For the first time during the entire pregnancy, I felt genuine fear, not because I was physically alone, but because I suddenly understood that I could not depend on the one person who was supposed to be standing beside me when things became difficult. And while I was trying to decide whether I should head to the hospital or wait a little longer, someone knocked on my front door. It was Evelyn, a retired neighbor who had lived across the street for years. She had noticed me pacing back and forth throughout the afternoon and decided to check on me. At first I tried minimizing the situation, but after another particularly painful contraction I finally explained what was happening, and the more details she heard, the more shocked she became. Evelyn immediately insisted on staying with me. She brought water, helped monitor the timing between contractions, and started doing all the things Ryan should have been doing from the beginning, while I continued trying to contact him without success, until something happened that transformed my concern into something much darker, because one of my calls was manually declined, not sent automatically to voicemail, declined by someone who had seen my name appear on the screen and consciously decided not to answer. And only a few minutes later I received a screenshot from social media showing my mother-in-law smiling beside Ryan and his father in front of a perfectly maintained golf course, each of them holding drinks, while a caption underneath celebrated a wonderful family weekend before life became busy. As I stared at that photograph, a contraction so intense that I nearly lost my balance forced me to grab the edge of the kitchen table. Evelyn immediately picked up her car keys and told me we were leaving for the hospital, and it was at that exact moment, while making one final attempt to call a husband who clearly had no intention of answering, that a completely different wave of pain shot through my body and left me struggling to breathe, because the contractions were no longer far apart. They were arriving faster, harder, and with alarming consistency, and for the first time since Ryan drove away that morning I understood that my son was probably about to enter the world while his father was still enjoying a golf tournament hundreds of miles away. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur of pain, anxiety, and disbelief, because even as the contractions became stronger and more frequent, a small part of me still expected Ryan to suddenly call back, apologize, and tell me he was already on his way home. But with every passing minute that hope became harder to maintain, Evelyn drove with remarkable calm while encouraging me to focus on my breathing. And between contractions I kept staring at my phone, watching unanswered messages pile up, listening to voicemail greetings, and realizing that the man who had promised to stand beside me during the most important moment of our lives had chosen to make himself completely unavailable. When we arrived at the hospital, the medical staff confirmed almost immediately what I had already begun to suspect. I was in active labor and there was a very real chance that my baby would be born within hours. One of the nurses asked who would be accompanying me through the delivery, and for the first time I had to say the words out loud. I had to explain that my husband was currently at a golf resort several hours away with his parents, and that I had been unable to reach him for most of their day. Even the nurse looked momentarily surprised before returning to her professional composure, because some situations are so absurd that they sound unbelievable even to people who spend their careers dealing with complicated family dynamics. As the hours passed, the contractions intensified and the reality of what was happening became impossible to ignore. Every time I saw another couple walking through the maternity ward, every time I watched an expectant father holding his wife's hand, helping her breathe, carrying her bags, or simply being present, I felt another wave of disappointment wash over me, because Ryan was not missing the birth due to an emergency, an accident, or circumstances beyond his control. He was missing it because he had willingly chosen a golf course over his family. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained by my side, answering questions, bringing me water, helping me stay calm, and providing more support in a few hours than my husband had offered during the entire crisis. Shortly before the delivery, I decided to call Ryan one final time, not because I believed he would answer, but because I needed to know I had done everything possible. The call went unanswered just like all the others, and only minutes later a friend sent me a screenshot that made me angrier than I thought possible under the circumstances. It was a social media post uploaded by my mother-in-law barely an hour earlier. A smiling photograph showing Ryan and his father celebrating a successful round of golf, accompanied by a caption about enjoying life's special moments and making family memories, while I was attached to monitors preparing to give birth to her grandson. My son was born later that evening, healthy, strong, and absolutely perfect, and although holding him for the first time was one of the happiest moments of my life, it was impossible to ignore the sadness that accompanied it, because the chair reserved for Ryan remained empty throughout the entire process. There were no emotional tears from a proud father, no trembling hands reaching out to hold his child, no family photographs capturing the beginning of a new chapter. There was only me, my newborn son, several extraordinary nurses, and a neighbor who had shown more commitment to our family in a single day than my husband had shown throughout the final weeks of my pregnancy. I believed things could not possibly become worse after that, but I was wrong, because the following morning, when Ryan finally turned his phone back on and discovered dozens of missed calls, his first reaction was not to apologize, not to ask whether his son was healthy, and not to rush to the hospital. His first reaction was sending a text asking why everyone was acting as though something terrible had happened. I remember staring at that message while holding my sleeping baby and feeling something inside me crack permanently, because until that moment I had convinced myself that perhaps he had simply exercised terrible judgment. But that text revealed something much more disturbing. He genuinely did not seem to understand the magnitude of what he had done. A few hours later he finally called, and the conversation somehow managed to be even more frustrating than the message. First he blamed poor cell service at the resort. Then he claimed his parents had assured him the baby would not arrive for several more days. Then he insisted that it was unfair to blame him for something nobody could have predicted. Every excuse sounded weaker than the last, and not one of them included genuine accountability, because taking responsibility would have required admitting that he had knowingly abandoned his wife at the worst possible time. Eventually he promised he would return the following day, a statement so detached from reality that I almost laughed, because he spoke about meeting his newborn son the next day the way someone might discuss rescheduling a business appointment. That night I barely slept, not because of the baby, who was surprisingly calm, but because my phone kept filling with messages from relatives. Some were furious on my behalf. Others tried defending Ryan by arguing that he probably had not understood how serious the situation was. But the message that caught my attention came from a woman I barely knew, the wife of one of my father-in-law's golf partners. She reached out simply to say she was sorry, because according to conversations she had overheard during the trip, this was not the first time the family had discussed the possibility of the baby arriving during the weekend. In fact, several people had warned them that scheduling the vacation so close to my due date was a terrible idea. That information immediately raised new questions, because it meant nobody could claim ignorance, nobody could pretend they had been surprised by the timing. Multiple people had warned them about exactly what might happen and they had chosen to proceed anyway. The more I thought about it, the less believable Ryan's explanations became, and the situation grew even more troubling when the same woman sent me another screenshot. This one taken from a private group chat used by several people attending the trip. Among the photographs and casual messages was a conversation where someone jokingly asked Ryan what he would do if the baby arrived during the tournament, and my father-in-law's response was so cold that I stared at the screen for several seconds before continuing. According to the message, Ryan should keep his phone turned off during the important rounds and focus on enjoying the weekend, because in his father's words, the baby will still be there when we get back. A sentence that made me feel physically sick, because it proved that this was not a misunderstanding, not an accident, and not bad timing. It was a conscious decision that had been discussed openly and defended repeatedly, despite everyone knowing exactly what was at stake. Still, the discovery that truly changed everything arrived only a few hours later, when I received an anonymous email from an address I did not recognize. At first I assumed it was a mistake or perhaps spam, but attached to the message were multiple screenshots of private conversations between Ryan and his parents from the weeks leading up to the trip, and as I began reading them my stomach tightened with every new message, because those conversations revealed that the vacation had not merely been scheduled despite my due date, it had been planned with full awareness of the risks, and even worse, they had spent weeks discussing strategies for convincing me to accept it without creating conflict. But when I reached one particular message written by Ryan only 3 days before labor began, I felt my blood run cold, because for the first time I was looking at evidence that did not simply explain what had happened. It revealed something far more disturbing about the man I had married. While my son slept peacefully beside my hospital bed, I spent most of the night rereading the screenshots that had arrived anonymously in my inbox, because the more carefully I examined those conversations, the harder it became to believe that Ryan's absence had been the result of poor judgment alone. Everything had been discussed in advance. His parents had repeatedly reminded him that my due date was dangerously close to the trip. Several friends had warned them that scheduling a golf weekend at that exact time was irresponsible, and yet they continued moving forward with their plans as though the birth of my child were nothing more than a scheduling inconvenience. What disturbed me most was not the decision itself, but the tone of the messages, because there was no hesitation, no concern, and no guilt, only confidence, sarcasm, and repeated jokes about how I would eventually calm down and get over it. And then I found the message that destroyed whatever hope remained for my marriage, a message Ryan had written only 3 days before leaving, where he casually explained that if the baby happened to arrive during the trip, I would have no choice but to move on because once the child was born there would be nothing anyone could do about it anyway. That was the moment I stopped asking myself how to repair the relationship and started asking myself how to protect my future, because suddenly everything became painfully clear. The problem was never that Ryan had missed the birth. The problem was that he had revealed exactly who he was at the moment when I needed him most, and if someone could abandon his wife one day before delivery in order to avoid missing a golf tournament, then there was no reason to believe he would suddenly become dependable once the difficult parts of parenthood arrived. So when he called again later that morning to announce that he was finally driving back and expected to spend the rest of the day with his son, I made a decision I never imagined I would have to make. I calmly informed him that I was not authorizing any hospital visits until I had spoken with legal counsel and established clear boundaries regarding our situation. The reaction was immediate and completely predictable, because people who are accustomed to avoiding consequences rarely respond well when those consequences finally arrive. Within minutes my phone began filling with messages accusing me of being vindictive, cruel, and emotional, first from Ryan, then from his mother, then from his father, all insisting that I was unfairly punishing him for a simple mistake, a narrative that became even more aggressive after they learned that hospital staff had been instructed not to allow unapproved visitors into my room. Suddenly the same family that had considered it perfectly reasonable to leave a heavily pregnant woman alone before labor was deeply offended that she had chosen to establish basic limits. And while they focused on portraying me as the villain, something else was happening beyond their control. The people who had actually witnessed the events were beginning to tell their own version of the story. Evelyn, several nurses, and a handful of relatives who knew what had happened started sharing details with friends and family members. And the more people learned about the circumstances surrounding the birth, the harder it became for Ryan's explanations to survive scrutiny, because there is no convincing excuse for ignoring dozens of calls from your wife while she is entering labor. There is no reasonable defense for posting vacation photos while your child is being born, and there is certainly no way to explain away private messages showing that the entire situation had been anticipated weeks in advance. One by one, family members who had initially defended him began asking uncomfortable questions, and for the first time Ryan found himself in a position he had rarely experienced before, having to answer for his own actions. Over the following weeks he launched what seemed to be a carefully planned campaign to repair the damage, showing up with flowers, gifts, handwritten letters, and emotional speeches about mistakes, growth, and second chances. But every conversation eventually ran into the same problem, because apologies only matter when they are supported by accountability. And Ryan appeared far more interested in restoring his reputation than understanding the harm he had caused, even when I confronted him with portions of the conversations from the screenshots. He tried minimizing them, insisting that people say stupid things in private all the time and that the messages have been taken out of context. But every attempt to justify himself only confirmed what I had already begun to realize, because for Ryan the crisis had started when other people found out what he had done, while for me the crisis had started the moment he chose to leave. As the months passed, the distance between us became impossible to ignore. Attorneys became involved, custody arrangements were discussed, financial responsibilities were established, and conversations about reconciliation gradually disappeared, a reality that infuriated my in-laws, who remained convinced that I was overreacting to a single unfortunate weekend. But the truth was much simpler than they wanted to admit. That weekend had not destroyed the marriage, it had exposed a pattern that had existed for years, a pattern where Ryan's comfort always came first and everyone else was expected to adjust around it. The birth of our son had not created the problem, it had simply removed any remaining ability to ignore it. The situation shifted even further when the person responsible for sending the anonymous screenshots finally came forward. He turned out to be one of my father-in-law's golfing friends, a man who had witnessed several conversations during the trip and had become increasingly uncomfortable with the way Ryan and his parents spoke about me behind my back. His testimony confirmed what the screenshots already suggested, that the family had knowingly proceeded with the vacation despite repeated warnings, and that Ryan's public claim that nobody expected the baby to arrive so soon was completely false, because multiple people had warned them about that exact possibility. And those revelations destroyed the final pieces of the story they had been trying to sell to friends and relatives. Perhaps the most satisfying part of the entire experience was watching their confidence slowly disappear once they realized they no longer controlled the narrative, because for years they had relied on appearances, money, and family pressure to avoid uncomfortable consequences. But truth has a remarkable way of spreading once enough people have seen it firsthand, and the more they attempted to defend themselves, the more obvious their lack of empathy became, to the point where several long-time friends quietly distanced themselves from the family, unwilling to associate with people who viewed the birth of a child as less important than a weekend of golf. Today my son is 3 years old, healthy, curious, energetic, and surrounded by people who genuinely care about him. And although one day he may hear this story, I will never tell it as a story about revenge, because revenge was never the goal. The real victory came from understanding what kind of environment I wanted to create for him, an environment where love meant responsibility, where promises mattered, and where people showed up when they were needed most, even when doing so was inconvenient, because anyone can be supportive during easy moments, but character is revealed when circumstances become difficult. Sometimes I still think about that morning when I watched Ryan drive away with his golf clubs while I stood one day away from giving birth, and I realize that painful moments occasionally provide the clearest answers, because in a single decision he revealed exactly how much I could depend on him when life demanded sacrifice. And although I felt abandoned, frightened, and completely alone at the time, I now understand that losing the illusion of a dependable marriage was a far smaller price than spending the rest of my life relying on someone who would always choose his own comfort over his family. In the end, there was no dramatic public scandal, no massive financial settlement, and no spectacular downfall, but I gained something far more valuable, the peace of knowing that my son would grow up surrounded by people who understood responsibility, while Ryan was left with a consequence far more difficult to escape, the knowledge that on the most important day of his child's life, he willingly chose a golf course instead, and some decisions, no matter how many excuses follow them, become permanent parts of a person's story forever.